Lovely. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Making City Resilient 2030 webinar series. I'm very pleased to be sharing with you that today we'll be discussing about the City Climate Finance GET Fund, which is a very interesting program that would help the cities to be able to enhance and improve the capacity to access finance. We also have with us today the colleagues from the City GET Funds, the European Investment Bank, the World Bank, and the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. And we'll be spending the maximum of 90 minutes in today's sessions about the GET Fund. The session will be run primarily in English, but we also have the interpretation available in Arabic and Russian. So if you see the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will be able to select Arabic and Russian as the language of your choice. And we also will be spending a good amount of time to answer your questions in the live sessions. And so if you have any questions directed to the speakers and particularly relevant to the GET Fund itself, then please drop your questions in the Q&A box. And with this, I would like to invite Mr. Sanjay Bhatia, Head of the Office for Northeast Asia and the Global Education and Training Institute of the UNDRR to officially welcome you to this event. Over to you, Sanjaya.
Thank you, Mai, and welcome to all the participants. As you know, this is part of a series under the Making Cities Resilient 2030, which is a brand new initiative started in January and all the way to the end of the decade in 2030, aiming to ensure that cities have the technical skills and the capabilities and the access to finance so that they are able to overcome the challenges that they face to achieve greater resilience. And this series, as you know, has been going on for some time. And today we have a discussion on the GAP Fund. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Mai, and then we go on with this program.
Yes, thank you, Sanjaya. And so for today's session, we'll be splitting into parts primarily. The first part will be basically the presentation about the GET Fund itself, and it will be led by the colleagues from the World Bank, Isabel, Margarita, Cantada, Urban Specialist of the World Bank, and also Giulia Macagno, Senior Economist and Head of the City Climate Finance GET Fund of the European Investment Bank Technical Secretariat. Then we'll be spending a lot of time to answer any questions that you may have about the GET Fund in the live Q&A, and it will be moderated by Asma, Jhina, City Resilience and Climate Finance Advisor of the GCoM. And so without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to the team, and over to you first, Marga.
Thank you, Mai, and I hope you can hear me okay. And thank you to all the participants for joining us today. Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Marga Cantada. I'm an urban specialist at the World Bank based in Washington, D.C. And it's both a pleasure and privilege for me to be presenting the GAP Fund alongside my colleague, Giulia Macagno from the European Investment Bank. The agenda, let me just share my screen first. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen. So
yes, it's clear.
Great. So the agenda for this presentation is to introduce you to the GAP Fund, what the rationale is for such a fund, what it is, what it supports, and how cities can apply for support. And I'll briefly walk you through some of the main elements of the GAP Fund, while Giulia will discuss the application process in greater detail. And as Mai mentioned, if there are any aspects not covered in the presentation that you would like to know more about, then we can try to cover them during the Q&A portion of this webinar. So what is the GAP Fund? Before going into detail about the GAP Fund, I think it's first important to understand the gap that is being addressed. As many of you might already know, there is an estimated $93 trillion worth of sustainable infrastructure that needs to be built between 2015 and 2030. This low carbon investment path requires upfront capital costs to invest in green and energy efficient technologies. Of this $93 trillion, around $4.5 trillion is required for project preparation. That's equivalent to roughly $300 billion each year, or 3 to 5% of total project investment costs. In developing and emerging markets, however, this could even go up to 10% of project costs. So what we then see is a paradox. Cities express a demand for financing climate solutions. Investors have the capital and are ready to invest in urban climate projects. And some project preparation facilities, which are currently operating in select regions or geographies, are ready to provide that support. And yet projects are unable to move from inception to financing. There are several reasons why this happens, but one of them, which I'm sure you would agree, is the fact that cities often lack the required capacity, resources, or enabling policy environment to prepare low carbon, climate resilient projects that can be financed by public organizations such as the World Bank, EIB, and other multilateral development banks, national governments, or the private sector. So another reason is the lack of support to the early stages of project preparation. As I just mentioned, most project preparation facilities are currently operating in select regions, and they target projects that are in the fairly advanced stages of the project preparation cycle, where there's a higher likelihood of implementation. As such, good project ideas that don't get picked up end up as mere concepts or ideas. So enter the City Climate Finance Gap Fund, or GAP Fund for short. The GAP Fund focuses on cities because cities play a critical role to meeting the global targets of the Paris Agreement, as well as the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Yet most in the Global South often struggle with developing a sound pipeline of climate smart investments. As such, the GAP Fund provides grants to cities for early stage technical assistance in developing climate change mitigation and adaptation projects. Who? We work with a number of partners, starting with our donors, the governments of Germany and Luxembourg, multilateral development banks, the World Bank and the European Investment Bank, implementing agencies, including the German Cooperation Agency, or GIZ, and finally, the city networks, which I'll get into in more detail in the next slide. On the how, we created a website, citygapfund.org, which contains important information about eligibility, the types of support that the GAP Fund can provide, the types of projects that can receive support, and the application process. City governments, city administrations that are interested in applying can submit an expression of interest. All that cities would need to do is to download the template that's available on the website and then upload and submit the expression of interest once it has duly been filled out. In this slide, we refer to the GAP Fund as one initiative with different implementing partners. The GAP Fund was operationally launched in September of last year during the Climate Week in New York City. And as I mentioned, the GAP Fund is managed by both the World Bank and the European Investment Bank in partnership with GIZ as its implementing partner. Then we have strong cooperation with city networks, particularly the Global Covenant of Mayors, C40, the Local Governments for Sustainability, or more commonly known as ICLEI, and the city's Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. And the figure at the bottom of the slide shows how this partnership and cooperation work in practice. Donors contribute to these two multi-donor trust funds, or MDTF, one managed by the bank and one managed by EIB in partnership with GIZ. The resources provided are then used to provide technical support for project preparation, which is rolled out to the different regions. In a previous slide, I mentioned early stage technical assistance. And I think here it's important to emphasize that the GAP Fund only provides grants for early stage support to project preparation. So in this slide, you'll see that the project cycle or project planning and development cycle is comprised of 5 phases. It starts with planning and strategy development, supported by data collection, target setting, scenario planning, and in-depth analytics, capacity building, and institutional reform and policy dialogue. Once an early concept for a project is developed, a project moves to project definition and to pre-feasibility. Then it moves to full feasibility when the detailed designs and tender or bidding documents of a project is prepared. Then on to transaction, investment, and pre-construction, and finally concluding with construction, operation, and actual project implementation. I make these distinctions because the GAP Fund, again, only focuses on the first 2 phases of the project preparation cycle, planning and strategy development, and project definition and project feasibility. We do not finance the actual implementation of projects. What the GAP Fund offers. So you can see that the GAP Fund offers various types of support, ranging from the formulation of city climate strategies or climate action plans, to capacity building, to supporting the identification and prioritization of investments that are typically part of an existing climate strategy or municipal investment program. And then we move a bit further downstream and also provide support in defining project concepts and preparing pre-feasibility studies, helping structure appropriate finance mechanisms for different projects. And finally, another important element of the GAP Fund, we also try to do some matchmaking by identifying additional sources of TA or technical assistance that can come in at later stages of project preparation. So we do our best to fill in these gaps by offering customized support based on the specific needs or characteristics of the proposals. I'll now talk about eligible projects that can receive GAP Fund support. In order for a project to be considered eligible for GAP Fund support, there are 5 main criteria that we use for selection. First is country eligibility. The project must come from either a low or middle income country that is officially part of the ODA OECD DAC list. So this list is publicly available and can be found on OECD's website. Next is climate action potential. When a city submits an expression of interest, we assess whether the project demonstrates a strong focus on climate mitigation or low carbon development, or resilience and climate adaptation, or both. So does the project demonstrate potential to be replicated in another country or city? Can it be scaled up to achieve ambitious climate impacts and goals that contribute to the Paris Agreement? Another important criterion is ownership. Does the project have political ownership? Is it a priority of the city and or country? Basically, the expression of interest must either be submitted by the city, by the local authority or municipal council, or on behalf of the city. And Giulia will touch on this during her presentation when she explains some of the do's and don'ts and the most frequently asked questions. The next one is urban dimension. So I probably don't need to elaborate further on this, but the project must be located in an urban area or must be functionally linked to an urban area. And when we say functionally linked, for example, a solid waste management project, it could be located in the outskirts of a city or in a low density area. But if it will serve a well-identified city or a set of municipalities adjacent to that site, then the urban dimension is verified or validated. Conversely, a renewable energy project located in a low density area may not exclusively serve a city, but rather feed into the grid. Therefore, the urban criterion of that project is not met. And finally, project stage or project maturity. And I think I've stressed this enough times already, but the project must either be in the planning or pre-feasibility stages. So any of these three steps or of where the city is would be considered eligible. I think also it's good to briefly mention here at this point that the GAP Fund is listed in the 2030 Making Cities Resilient dashboard and is available to MCR 2030 cities in stage C of the resilience roadmap. So cities that have already run the resilience diagnostics using tools such as the Disaster Resilience Scorecard and have set their priorities for risk reduction and resilience planning are encouraged to apply, provided that they're able to clearly articulate the city's needs and propose interventions when submitting an expression of interest. So we also provide an extensive list of eligible sectors that have strong climate mitigation and or adaptation potential. This includes urban transport and mobility, energy efficiency and small-scale renewables, solid waste management and approaches to a circular economy, water and wastewater management, greening of urban areas, green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, green buildings and energy efficient buildings, adaptation to climate vulnerabilities, affordable housing with an energy efficient approach, multi-sector area-based investment programs, such as informal settlement or urban upgrading projects, brownfield redevelopments, urban regeneration or revitalization, and transit corridor development, provided that, again, these contribute to these proposals have a strong mitigation or low carbon focus or a resilience and adaptation focus or both. So I'll now discuss a few examples of projects we are currently supporting to give you an idea as you think through your own proposals. There are 4 types that I'd like to illustrate, 2 that are more upstream and at the strategic level, and then in the next slide, 2 that are more downstream and project specific. So the first example is the formulation of a city climate action plan to improve a city's adaptation and mitigation strategy and develop capacity. Some of the specific TA activities would typically include a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, climate risk vulnerability assessment, scenario planning to estimate the potential greenhouse gas emissions reduction in a city based on selected interventions, and preparing a climate-informed or climate-smart capital investment plan. Another example of an upstream project would be the development of climate-smart design guidelines to help mainstream low-carbon development in planning standards or urban development programs. So specific TAs that have been requested, some examples include developing standards for sustainable and green urban planning, identifying incentives for developers to adopt green building labels, or the use of low carbon construction materials. So as we move downstream, you'll see that we can also support sector-specific ideas. So in the first example, we have the development of a sustainable urban transport system through the electrification of buses. This obviously has the potential to significantly reduce carbon emissions from private vehicles and diesel-run buses. So in this case, some of the TA requested included a preliminary analysis of alternative fleet options, conducting a demand study for urban transport, and developing a business plan and an analysis of financing options. The last example I'll leave you with is exploring the potential of nature-based solutions and urban green space creation. This project clearly demonstrates strong potential because it will contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, reduce exposure to flood and erosion, and mitigate the impacts of an urban heat island effect. And the type of activities that could be supported include conducting a preliminary cost-benefit analysis for a project that has already been identified, or more generally, a climate risk and vulnerability assessment for the area. And with that, I'll stop here, and I hope Giulia's already, yeah, great. I'll hand it over to Giulia, who will give an overview of the application process. Giulia, over to you.
Thank you very much. I apologize. I have to join from my phone because I had an issue with my computer. So I'm not able to turn on my video, but I hope you can hear me okay. Well, thank you very much, Marga. What I would like to talk about now is briefly take you through the concrete steps that need to be done by an applicant in order to submit an expression of interest to the GAP fund and to receive GAP fund support. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, here you can see a snapshot of the expression of interest form. I think it's worthwhile going through it quickly, so it's clear what we expect and what we are asking for. So the first section of information that we request refers to the basic data, the standard data about the proposal and the entity that submits the proposal. We would like to know the title of the proposed activity, of course, and then it is very important for us to have a clear understanding of who the applicant is and the city and country, of course, for which the expression of interest is submitted. I think this is very important to stress that in case we have an entity submitting an expression of interest on behalf of a municipal authority or another local authority, then we need to know very clearly we need to be stated very clearly that the expression of interest is submitted on the city's behalf. And this is very important, going back to Marga's point earlier about political ownership at the local level. And we will get to some of the eligibility criteria for the applicants later on in the do's and don'ts section, and then in the frequently asked questions. The second step is to tell us basically what is the sector that the proposal focuses on. So here we have a list that includes pretty much everything that is eligible. You can check several boxes. However, it is important that the proposals are as specific as possible. So try to focus and to show us that you have a clear view of what the GAP fund can support you with. Then, of course, we have the climate focus. We have said before that we cover both mitigation and adaptation. It can be either or both. Of course, if you check the box none, it means that it reduces seriously the chances that your project is going to be eligible, because the climate focus is one of the key selection criteria. And then, and this is also very important, what stage of the project cycle you're in. So we focus on up to pre-feasibility stage. So we would like to know what has already been done, basically. So if you have done the first two, so you have developed the strategy and you have developed the concept, then you would check the box pre-feasibility study, because this is where your project is currently sitting. And you can see that there is a box called feasibility study. Although we have said in Marga's part of the presentation, we've said that we stop at pre-feasibility. However, we recognize that the project cycle is not necessarily a linear one. So it's not, so not all projects will go through all the stages in the right order. So there may be gaps. Things that should have been done before. So even if your project is at feasibility study, you may still need something to fill in the existing gaps in what has been done before. And it is important to stress that these are exceptional cases. So we have the option to look into that, but the focus of the GAP fund is clearly on early stages of the project preparation cycle. So again, the type of support that is requested, so you have to tell us basically if you are if we are more upstream or a little more downstream in the type of support that you're requesting. And then I think the box number 10 is really the key of your expression of interest, because it tells us that the city has clearly identified what the challenges or the issues are. It has identified a proposed scope of intervention. So you know what you would like to do in order to tackle the challenges that you have identified. And then also what are the expected environmental, social and economic benefits that would result from the realization, the implementation of the project. So it is important that we understand as well what type of GAP fund support you would you think it's needed. Although I have to stress that this is just an initial screening. So we look at your expression of interest to see whether the project is eligible, and then when we go into a more detailed assessment of the proposal, we would ask you, we would ask the city more questions, and we would try to define the scope of the technical assistance later on. But it is very useful for us to show that you have a clear understanding of what the problem is and how you would like to go about it. Next slide, please. So the second part of the expression of interest form tells us whether you have worked with one or the other organizations that are involved in the GAP fund already. So what we are asking for here is if you have already worked with the World Bank, the EIB or GIZ, please specify what type of assignment. Was it technical assistance only? Was it a project? Was it an investment? And when was this realized, and so on. This also tells us basically if you have already a relationship with one of us, it may make more sense that the same institution follows up on your application, although there is no guarantee, because each expression of interest is assessed individually and the follow-up is determined on a case-by-case basis. Then we are also asking whether the proposed intervention is linked or is in line with the local planning, the national government strategies, and so on. So here we ask you to tick different boxes to tell us basically whether the city has a climate action plan or a resilience strategy, whether the urban development plans are up to date, whether they are there, whether they need to be completed or modified, and then whether the project contributes to nationally determined contributions or the national climate action plan or resilience strategies if available. Again, it is important for us to understand whether you received some support from different entities, basically to complete your expression of interest. This allows us to track the channels of entry, basically, of the various applications that we receive. And then finally, an optional box. So if you have results from previous studies, for instance, or other elements that you think are relevant for us to make a decision as to whether the GAP fund should support your project, then this is the place where to put this information. Then another point that I would like to stress is the fact that we are asking whether we can share your information with members of the CCFLA, and this comes back to what Marga was referring to as matchmaking before, because we really try to work outside the normal silos of each institutions working for themselves, and we are trying to make sure that we give your projects the maximum possible visibility, even if you may not receive GAP fund support because the resources are limited, or because your project is valuable but not enough on the climate side or not enough on the city side. So we can try to refer your projects to other entities that may be interested in supporting you. Next slide, please. So how do we treat the expressions of interest? So we've seen that we have created a website, citygapfund.org, and on each page of this website, you can find the link apply for support, and this takes you to the page where you can download the expression of interest and re-upload it once it has been completed. So what happens next is that as the EOI is submitted, both the EIB and the World Bank GAP Fund Secretariats receive the expression of interest. We meet every 2 weeks and we discuss the eligibility. So basically, whether the project has been presented by an eligible applicant, a city, a local authority, or a municipal agency, and so on, whether the city is located in an OECD DAC country, whether the project has an urban dimension, whether the project has a sufficient climate dimension, climate ambition, and also whether the project is at the early stage of the preparation. So once we have decided that, we also decide which organizations, EIB, GIZ, or World Bank, follows up on your application. If your project is eligible, the GAP Fund team will contact you and establish a schedule of calls or interviews to specifically define the scope of the technical assistance. And the technical assistance, once approved, it will be deployed either directly by the World Bank and the EIB or GIZ, or through external consultants. The external consultants will be recruited by us, by the World Bank, EIB or GIZ. if the application is found to be non-eligible, I think this is also very important, we respond in the shortest possible delays to the applicant. And we also, in the response, we also explain why we think the application is not eligible. This gives the possibility, in case we have misunderstood, in case the expression of interest was not presented clearly, it gives the possibility to resubmit. So if you receive a non-eligible response and you still think we have misunderstood, we are happy to reconsider, although our eligibility check is generally pretty thorough. So so far, we haven't found examples where we said, no, it's not eligible, and then we had to go back to our decision, but we are happy to establish a dialogue in that case. Next slide, please. So some of the feedback, which we think is very useful, because we have been giving this feedback a lot in expressions of interest that we have received so far. On the do's side, please state very clearly who the applicant is. If it is on behalf of a city official, also share the name and position and contact information of the official, in addition to those of the person that actually fills in the expression of interest. The city ownership, the local ownership, is one of the first things that we check. So it increases indeed the chances that your application goes through if this information is filled in correctly. Then emphasize the climate focus. So it has to be, so it's called the City Climate Gap Fund. So indeed, climate is the main, should be the main goal of the project. So we have sometimes seen projects, applications presented where the project would definitely have very good environmental and social impacts, but not all environmental impacts are climate impacts. So the focus on climate is paramount in your expression of interest. And then be precise as much as possible as to the stage in which the project is and what kind of technical assistance you are requiring. Marga has already said this, but I think it's important to stress again that the GAP Fund does not finance project implementation. So if your project is ready and you're just requesting financing or looking for financing, the GAP Fund is not the right initiative to provide support, because we don't provide investment. We provide just the technical assistance. Then on the don't side, it's kind of the reverse. So basically, if you are a private entity or an individual without the approval and the support of the public entity that is concerned, your application will not be eligible. Again, proposals that don't have a clear climate focus will likely not be considered eligible. And we receive a large volume of applications, so we have to be very strict as to the screening criteria. And also generic applications that are for which we don't understand clearly what you are asking in terms of technical assistance, they will not disqualify you necessarily, but it would make it harder for us to clearly say, yes, this project is eligible, let's go to the detailed assessment phase. So next slide, please. In terms of the queries that we have received, we have in the beginning in particular, we have received a lot of these queries, now probably a little less, because we are really trying to get the message across, but these are the most frequent that we see. So first question that we get is, are NGOs or associations or civil societies organization eligible for GAP Fund as GAP Fund beneficiaries? They are not, because of the issue of the solid proof of local political support. So we can accept applications from entities that act on behalf of the city, but we will definitely request the city to be involved and to prove that they are behind the project, and they will help also our consultants or our experts in assessing the project and providing the technical assistance. Second question that we get a lot is, again, do you provide financing for project implementation? And as we said, only technical assistance for early stage project preparation can be provided by the GAP fund. Another question that we get very often is, do we recruit freelance consultants? Do we accept job application or support individual projects? And the answer is no. So for recruitment, we don't have open positions so far. If opportunities will open up, they will be advertised on the website of the EIB, World Bank, or GIZ for specific position and following the standard recruitment process. So we are not going to give follow-up to CVs or requests of this type. And then can the cities or local authorities share financial support they received with NGOs, associations, or other entities with whom they already collaborate? So this is a question that we get a lot, and it's important to stress that the technical assistance provided by the GAP fund is provided directly and in kind. So the cities, the local authorities do not receive an envelope of resources to be used to recruit their own consultants or pay other organizations that do work for them. So again, this is something that we stress very often. And then is it possible for a public body, for instance, an association of municipalities, to present an EOI on behalf of several smaller municipalities? Yes. This is allowed, and indeed it is a way for smaller municipalities to achieve a bigger scale and therefore a bigger expected climate impact that would allow us to, that would increase the chances that we provide technical support to these projects. So next slide, please. So I think we are at the end of our presentation. We're happy to take your questions. And also there is a whole wealth of information. Pretty much everything we said today is on the website, citygapfund.org, that of course you are encouraged to visit and check regularly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marga and Giulia, for taking us through the GAP fund. We've had quite a lot of questions coming through, and I'm going to try and coherently take us through them now. A couple of them I've begun to answer already in the Q&A section. The first question that we had come through was around clarification about ADB's involvement, and I clarified that actually the GAP fund is implemented by the World Bank and EIB. And then there were some questions around which countries are eligible to apply, so particularly for the Philippines, Pakistan and South Sudan, and Mai very kindly shared the OECD DAC list. And if the countries are on that list, then the cities within those countries or urban areas in those countries are eligible to apply. I'll just pause there for a second. Marga and Giulia, is there anything you'd like to add to those 2 points before we move on with the other questions?
No, I think on my side, they're clear. Thanks.
Great. So then moving forward, there was a question about whether or not the GAP fund and the Corpus fund are linked. And I don't know if, I'm not familiar with the Corpus fund, but I don't know if others are.
I personally am not, but I'd let Marga maybe reply to this.
No, unfortunately, I'm also not familiar with the Corpus fund.
So my assumption was that probably not, because all of us that work on the GAP fund aren't familiar with it, but happy to pick up with you, Dr. Das, separately on that as well. And there was a question from Ronaldo about how different is the GAP fund from the regular project preparation technical assistance provided by the World Bank and other multilateral development partners? Margaret, I don't know if you want to take that first.
Sure. So at least I can speak on for the World Bank. As I well, maybe have alluded to, the project preparation that is typically carried out by the bank is usually for project IDs that are already in the advanced stages. So that's when it's at the stage where the team prepares the full feasibility studies, including the detailed designs, the engineering designs, the drawings, and the bidding documents. So typically, World Bank support includes some pre-feasibility, but not entirely the planning, and doesn't typically get involved in the planning and pre-feasibility stage, and that's where the GAP fund could potentially intervene.
And if I may just compliment on the EIB side, indeed, we are generally involved much later in the project cycle. So in the majority of cases, the projects that come for the EIB, they come for financing and they are already pretty well developed. It is true that we have access to some facilities for project preparation, of course, but generally they concentrate on the feasibility stages. So once the project has been clearly defined and the concept is clear, the location is clear and so on, so then we can provide some support for the feasibility stage, but we normally don't intervene so early on in the project cycle. So the GAP fund is very complementary to the offer of the EIB as well.
And it's specifically, just to add to that, it's specifically designed to meet the gap in getting climate smart projects. So there's a recognized gap that the City Climate Finance Gap Fund is intended to fulfill. Thank you for that, both. Then we have a number of questions asking for clarification on eligibility. So the overarching question from Druba was who can apply for the GAP fund, but additional kind of questions in similar area are, can cities apply directly, or does it need to be endorsed and applied through, I guess they mean the national government? Who exactly can apply for the fund? Should it only be municipal city personnel, or can other institutions or NGOs do so? Are there specific criteria a city must fulfill before applying for this fund? And there are a couple more, but I'll stop there rather than bombarding you, and then I can add them as you respond.
So maybe I can start on this on the eligibility side. So in terms of, I start from the end. So in terms of criteria for that cities need to fulfill, as long as the city is in a country that is part of the OECD DAC list, then they are eligible. In terms of who can effectively submit the application, we are looking for ideally the application is submitted by a city official, a civil servant working in the city. It can also be, for instance, a municipal company, or a utility company that works with a clear public service, let's say, mandate. If the applicant is not directly the city, but the application is submitted, the expression of interest is submitted on behalf of the city, we are asking for in the expression of interest, we're asking for the contact details of a person within the city administration that is aware of the project, that we can involve in the subsequent discussions. It is important that to say that we will check this city involvement, the public ownership of the project, during our assessment. So if the project looks eligible, but we're not really sure whether it is submitted on behalf of the city and the city is really aware, we probably just set up a quick call without launching the full detailed assessment process, because the ownership at the local level is really important. Then, of course, we move towards the national level, and it is indeed important to us that whatever project is submitted is in line with national strategies or the NDC strategy, for instance. I think this is crucial, and the reason why we check that is because we want to avoid that we provide support to a project that then is not in line with what the government, the national government, thinks the cities should be doing, and as such, the projects may get stuck later on and not progress. So we want to make sure, since the resources are limited, that we provide TA to projects that have the highest chances of effectively being implemented, although the process we are aware is quite long. So we don't, at the stage of the expression of interest submission, we don't request like a formal endorsement by the national authorities. However, this point is something that we check later on as we go through the detailed assessment. And indeed, if you check yes on the box that says is the project in line with the national strategies and so on, and whether the strategies have already been developed and so on, this also helps us understand that you're very well aware of what happens at the national level. I hope I tackled all the points. Yeah, the NGO thing is one of the most frequently asked questions. So we don't consider application from NGOs as per se eligible, because we have seen that often there is a lack of there can be a lack of support, political support at the city level, and also the important point to stress is that we don't give funds directly to an entity that could perform the technical assistance. So we had the case where some NGOs have submitted an application requesting for support for the activities that they are already doing with the cities, and unfortunately we cannot, because the technical assistance is provided directly by EIB, World Bank, GIZ experts, or by consultants that are recruited directly by us. So I hope this covers everything.
And if I may just quickly compliment Giulia on the question about political ownership. So if an expression of interest is considered eligible and it advances to, as Giulia mentioned, a more detailed assessment phase, we work with the city team to develop a detailed proposal, defining the specific scope of work that the GAP fund will support. And it's during this phase that we may ask for supporting documentation, and that includes some form of written endorsement from the local authority, so we know that this is in line with the strategy of the city and or contributing to the goals of the national government. Just to keep that in mind in the application process.
Thanks, Giulia and Marga. That's really helpful. So some of these are coming in, and so apologies if I'm not as coherent in sharing them. I'll try my best. So we have a question here from Tushar, linked again to criteria. His question is, do there exist any specific criteria a city must fulfill before applying for this fund? I mean, you've talked about the eligibility criteria. Are there any additional things that a city needs to do to be eligible?
Well, this would be more relevant if we were talking about an actual investment in the project, in the implementation of the project. In that case, I can speak for the EIB, but yes, there are criteria as to the credit worthiness and so on. We consider those. Of course, we ask those questions in the detailed assessment, because we would like to make sure that the projects that receive GAP fund support have the highest chances of being financed and implemented in the future. However, it is not an exclusion criteria. So what we are asking is, aside from the geographical eligibility, we are looking for cities that have, we're looking for projects that have an ambitious climate impact. It's not defined because it's very, very difficult to establish a scale, and we don't want to exclude necessarily maybe smaller projects, so we don't want to have a criterion as to the total size of the project. However, it is important that the climate impact is sizable. So if you are thinking of submitting an application from a small city in a rural area, it is possible that we would reply to you that, yes, in theory you're eligible. However, we have to prioritize projects that have a larger expected climate impact. So the key in that case would be to try and submit maybe a grouped application from a group of neighboring municipalities, for instance, that can ensure that if the project is then implemented, it will have a larger, a more ambitious climate impact. So, but there are not strict criteria as to the size of the project or the size of the potential investment later on.
Thank you, Giulia. So again, another related question. If municipalities and cities can access or avail on the GAP fund and they are eligible for this, do they need to submit requirements directly to the organisation? So I think that's about how do cities, local authorities, municipal councils, how do they submit their applications?
I think I can take this one if okay, Giulia. So as Giulia mentioned in her presentation, cities submit an expression of interest through the GAP fund website, and a template is provided in several languages, and then once if the GAP fund, meaning the World Bank and EIB technical secretariats, review and assess that the project or the proposal is considered eligible, then we reach out to the applicant or the city team to define the scope of work on the technical assistance that will be financed through the GAP fund. And so then we will, at least for I can speak on the World Bank side, we would ask teams to prepare a detailed proposal, and as I mentioned, may include requesting for additional or supporting documentation, but that would be determined based on the needs articulated in the proposal.
Thanks, Marga.
Yeah, just very quickly, I totally support what Marga said. On the EIB side, it's pretty much the same process. So we want to minimize the work of the cities for projects that we are relatively sure that can get GAP fund support. So that's why the expression of interest is fairly simple, and we don't request a lot of we don't request documents to be added and to be annexed to the expression of interest. However, if in your expression of interest you mentioned that the city has a climate action plan or a resilience strategy, and this is relevant for the projects that you are submitting, we will most probably ask you during the discussion in the detailed assessment to provide us access to this documentation, and then as for the final scope of the technical assistance, indeed it's the same as Marga said. On the EIB side, we talk, basically the Secretariat people talk to the applicant. We may involve different departments of the city if the project requires so, and then we basically establish together with the city a scope of activities that can be supported by the GAP fund. So the city may come with different ideas, and then together we select what is the most relevant and what is the type of technical assistance that cannot be provided by other sources and will be a blocking point for the project if it is not done properly or not done now, basically. So that's why it is every TA is tailor-made, so we don't have like a bank of templates that we use, and this is why the discussion and the quality of exchanges with the cities is crucial in this phase, because it will help us determine precisely what type of TA is most useful for the project.
Thank you, Giulia and Marga again. Linked to criteria, we have a question from Nonofo. I'm not part of local government structure and have seen from my region and have not seen any from my region participating in any of these platforms. What can I do to make sure our local government is aware of such opportunities and also take advantage of them to invest in my city towards resilience? So I think the question there is, how can I engage my local government, my regional government, my local cities to engage in the GAP fund?
Yes, so this, I think it's a very relevant point, and indeed, although NGOs and other civil society organizations are not eligible per se, they are widely encouraged to engage with their local governments if they already have contacts, to make them aware of the GAP fund if they haven't heard of it yet, and explain how, or maybe help them filling in an expression of interest form. So this informal support of the government to the city government, the city administration, is very important. And we will produce, so you can direct them to the GAP Fund website, where we have a lot of this information that we just have discussed. We are planning to produce a brochure that can then be shared. So we will make it available, of course, on the website as soon as it's ready. And we are having this webinar. We had several other in the past, so we are trying to reach out to different platforms to make sure that at least this is known as an opportunity. But of course, anything you can do to, if you have a project in mind or something that you think could be a good way to ensure the low carbon development or the resilient development of a city, you can propose it to the local government. You can direct them to us. We are also happy to reply to on the page where you can request support. There is also an email address that can be used if the local government, for instance, has questions or would like to understand whether they have a good chance of being selected or not, although we cannot provide a definitive answer, but we are happy to tackle all queries as well. So it is a question of initiative. Unfortunately, there is not a formal mechanism, but I think the role of civil society organizations and entity or research institute is extremely important in promoting the GAP fund.
Thank you, Margaret. Something you'd like to add to that?
No, I think Giulia's responded to the question very well. I do like to emphasize, from the GAP fund side, both from World Bank and EIB, we're trying to do as much outreach, participating in as many webinar events as we can to really get the message out there about this GAP fund, and that it's available to cities. So please do continue to check the website, as Giulia mentioned, for any updates or any upcoming events where we will present the GAP fund.
Thank you. And I can add, I didn't, I went straight into the question and answer, and I didn't really introduce myself, which I should have done. So I'm Asma Jhina from the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and I'm the City Resilience and Climate Finance Advisor. And I can say that we work in close partnership with the EIB and World Bank, as well as other city networks and organizations to do some outreach as well. And if you are part of a GECoM signatory cities already working on a climate action plan, please do reach out to me personally, or reach out to the city network that you work most closely with for support on the GAP fund as well. And very happy to kind of work indirectly too. So apologies, I didn't introduce myself previously. So moving on then, there's a question from Susanna. How can we collaborate for the private sector in Latin America?
Yes, maybe I'll start and then I'll let Marga also complete. I think indeed the involvement of the private sector is very important, and we're looking for projects that can potentially also generate a private sector investment or co-investment. So it is very important that although it is true that most of the projects that will be supported by the GAP fund are public sector projects, projects that do not necessarily generate sufficient revenue for the private sector to be interested in. But what is important is that we invest in something which is an ecosystem that allows other projects to be generated and created and financed by the private sector as well. So the answer to me is similar to what I said for the NGOs. So if private companies have good relationship with the local authorities, they can encourage them to submit an expression of interest. At least on the EIB side, one of the questions that we deal with, we ask in the detailed assessment phase, is whether there is potential for private sector involvement. So if there is, of course, it strengthens the application. I would encourage private companies that are interested in seeing some evolution in one of the sectors that can be covered by the GAP fund to engage with local authorities and make them aware, if they're not, that the GAP fund exists. Of course, private companies are not eligible per se, as NGOs are not eligible per se as beneficiaries. However, an interest from the private sector definitely strengthens the likelihood that a project will go ahead later on after all the technical assistance has been put in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Giulia, for that very comprehensive response. We have a question from Ronaldo. So just skipping ahead a little bit. In the presentation where you looked at the expressions of interest form, Giulia, in section 8 or in question number 8, why is feasibility part of it? You mentioned earlier the GAP fund will not finance feasibility studies. So I think there's a really interesting question there about the breadth of work that the GAP fund will support.
Indeed, and it is a very important question. Thank you for asking this. It gives me the opportunity to stress, indeed, the GAP fund focuses on the early stages of the project preparation. However, we recognize as well that there may be, so the project itself may be at the feasibility stage. However, some gaps may emerge during that phase where you realize, for instance, oh, we should have done this particular study and this should have been done in the previous phases of the project preparation. However, it is needed for the project to go forward. So we could potentially provide support to fill in those gaps at different stages of the project cycle. Although these are very exceptional cases, so the argumentation and the reason for us to get involved at a later stage to fill in other gaps would have to be very, very clearly explained. So in most cases, if the project is at feasibility stage, we would say no. But of course, it is difficult to have to have a clear-cut view of where one phase begins and the other phase ends in the project cycle. So we included this because we want to be able to look at the projects, and if indeed we think that the support that is required is too downstream, we may be able to direct the project to another project preparation facility, and this is why we ask for your authorization to share the information with other entities that are part of the CCFLA, other city networks, or other entities that work that have project preparation facilities under their scope of activities, because maybe the GAP fund cannot support it, but somebody else can. So so that's why we put the feasibility stage as well. Although for the time being, I have to say that there were very, very little expressions of interest that were submitted at the feasibility stage, because there are other entities that can provide support. So if you have a gap that has been that has emerged and should have been filled in earlier, that could be eligible. Or for instance, the project has done a feasibility study has been done already, but it was done a long time ago, and things have changed in the project, in the conditions of the project. So there is a need to update some of the studies that have been done before. That is also a case where we could consider support, even if the project is at a later stage. I hope this is clear enough.
That was very clear, Giulia. Thank you very much. Margaret, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think Giulia responded very well, so nothing to add from my side.
Great. I just want to make sure that we've got it covered from the EIB and the World Bank side. We have a follow-up question from Ronaldo Chang as well. How do you define entities to be eligible to submit expressions of interest? Can entities be individuals with local political support?
So normally, no, in the sense that we are really looking for, so it's not just a local political support, meaning that you are an individual, you have a good contact in the municipality that you can put as a co-contact in the application, and this would be enough. So what we want is an application submitted by an entity that can either follow up on the technical assistance, meaning giving access to the consultants to relevant documentation, or helping them organizing meetings with stakeholders and so on. So we really need someone who's not just well connected with the administration, but is also able to follow up, which is why we normally don't consider applications from entities that are not public entities. So individuals, I would say it is a bit difficult that it would pass. Each case is unique, but as a general rule, we would prefer to avoid that, because we don't want the project to be hinging on just one person. If the person moves, nothing else can be done, and we have mobilized technical assistance for something that is then stuck later on.
Thank you again. Moving on a little bit, more sort of conceptual question from Marwan Kudmani, who asks, is there a possibility of funding cities to be smart cities with high technologies? I've asked for clarification on that question, but I think what we're saying is we do want climate smart technologies solutions. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think I mean, if the the participant can elaborate more on the question. I think conceptually, yes, provided that these smart city applications do contribute to climate mitigation and will improve the urban policy environment. In theory, yes, we can support that, provided that all other criteria that we mentioned are met. So smart city applications and technologies and how that could be applied would be possible.
Yes, and also again, it's not funding. So whenever I hear the word funding, I'm a bit skeptical. So once again, only technical assistance. But for instance, if you would like to see whether there is, I don't know, whether it would make economic sense to install a certain type of smart city technologies, or a comparison of different types of technologies depending on the cities. So these are all things that can be done. Just be careful that the project is early stage enough to receive technical assistance.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question from, apologies, we have a follow-up question from Tommaso. So you've mentioned affordable housing with an energy efficient approach as one of the eligible sectors for GAP fund support. Have you already supported projects of this type?
Yes.
So yeah, Marga, maybe you want to start answering the question and I can come in later.
Yes, so if you look in the website, we released a number of short stories featuring some of the proposals that have already been part of the first round of GAP fund proposals. And I believe one of those proposals was looking into how to incorporate climate-informed, how to mainstream climate considerations in affordable housing, large-scale affordable housing programs. So looking at the use of low-carbon materials, construction materials, green urban planning standards, and so looking into providing technical assistance into how such an affordable housing program could be climate smart. So it is possible.
Great, thank you. I'm going to skip a few questions, and given that the time that we've got, if there are specific follow-on questions that you have, there is a form on the website that you can use to reach out to the GAP Fund, or as I said, if you're a GECoM signatory city, feel free to reach out to me as well. But I'm going to skip a couple of these questions that might be a little repetitive in their response, and prioritize some different ones, if that's okay. So then we come to, I guess, a lot of comments in the chat box, Giulia and Marga, have been around the COVID pandemic and how that at the moment is a priority for governments. I wonder if you'd be able to share some thoughts on how the GAP Fund might support and can work hand in hand with ambitions around sort of risk reduction for the COVID pandemic and any future pandemics.
Yes, sure. And if Giulia, if it's okay for me to start, and feel free to come in and complement. So yes, we do recognize, that we're still in a pandemic, or many cities are still recovering from the global pandemic. And as I can only speak for the bank side, for the World Bank, we recently announced the Climate Change Action Plan, and part of that is how to support cities transition to a greener and more inclusive, how to support them in a green and inclusive recovery from COVID-19. So we do encourage cities to submit proposals that do have a link to recovering from these from the long-term impacts, how proposals could help transition to maybe greener or more efficient technologies, how to support green jobs creation. So if we given this time, if a proposal can link that to an economic recovery, then that is highly encouraged within the GAP Fund. And we have a note also. Yes. Go ahead, Giulia.
No, I just wanted to say that in the expression of interest, you can list if you have a specific idea of how the project can provide support to the green recovery or to prevent or deal with the consequences of future pandemics. These are economic and social co-benefits. And so in the open question that we discussed before as to what type of support are you requesting from the GAP fund, what is the problem, and so on, you have the possibility to put there the expected benefits, and this would definitely strengthen your proposal in terms of the GAP fund.
And just to briefly add, on the website, we do have some information of, and a note and some blogs that have been posted on the website that try to identify, specific sectors or interventions that could contribute both to the climate goals and help with mitigating the impacts of COVID-19. So we try to find specific areas, and from our view, strengthening. Providing upstream planning support and support to project concepts would be a good entry point for helping on that recovery.
Super, thank you. I'm going to focus on the last 3 or 4 questions now. So one of the comments, in fact, from Dr. Dennis Onyama is that procedures for project preparation should be a little easier. The GAP fund should designate a contact person for each initial applicant to check eligibility and reorientate the applicant at that initial stage, if possible, before they go ahead to spend time and resources towards the wrong direction in the application process. I mean, it'd be good, Giulia and Marga, for you to reassure. I know from the cities that I'm working with that are GECoM signatory cities that actually this application, if you know what you're applying for, should take you 60-90 minutes to fill, and the intention is that the GAP fund will work with partners. So if it's not eligible for the GAP fund, as we were saying with the feasibility question, it can maybe go through to another project preparation facility for support. But Giulia, Marga, maybe you can kind of elaborate a little bit on your processes. I know there's a question also about how long does it take you to review. When do you go back to cities with your kind of response or your conclusion? How much funding are these cities then eligible for? And finally, does implementation of that technical assistance need to be through EIB or World Bank? So just a little elaboration on that process would be really helpful.
Yeah, so maybe I can start on this. I agree that defining the scope of the technical assistance and filling in expressions of interest can be a daunting task for municipalities. And indeed, as Asma was saying, we are working with different entities, the city networks in particular, GECoM in particular, but also our own offices, EIB, GIZ, World Bank, teams that are in contact already with the cities to help to guide them briefly to fill in the expression of interest. So indeed, the expression of interest has been designed to be as simple as possible. Of course, we need to ask for some information. So that's why we try to keep it short, and then most of the detailed questions would be then asked and answered during the detailed assessment phase, where we did go in depth as to what the project is, what type of support can be provided, and so on. It is difficult to assign one person per expression of interest due to the number of expression of interest that we are receiving. So what we can do is that as soon as we receive an expression of interest, of course, we screen it together, EIB, World Bank, and GIZ. We decide whether it is eligible or not. If it is not eligible, the answer should come relatively quick. So we are trying to keep it to keep this waiting time as short as possible. Of course, due to the volume of applications, some of the months it can be challenging. We don't have a huge number of people per secretariat because we want most of the resources to be used for actual technical assistance. So that's a kind of trade-off that we should be aware of. So as to what happens after we receive the expression of interest, indeed, every 2 weeks we talk together with the World Bank and we decide on eligibility of expressions of interest that have been received in the preceding 2 weeks. After that, it may be the case that an expression of interest looks eligible, but we need to check with our colleagues internally, the regional desks, the sector experts, and so on. So this phase is variable, and it depends very much on the, of course, on the workload of our colleagues, but a lot depends on the quality of the information that is presented in the expression of interest. So the clearer the expression of interest, the shorter would be the assessment time. Once we have decided that we want to go ahead with a detailed assessment, then we start setting up at least a preliminary call, but generally there is several calls that happen with the applicants and the cities. We may ask to involve different departments of the city. So indeed, again, the time varies, but the responsiveness of the city officials and the applicant is what determines indeed the pace at which we are able to do the assessment. We are trying to keep it again as short as possible for the time being. I mean, I don't want to say that we are flooded with expression of interest, but we are receiving a lot. So of course, that's there are some incompressible delays on this point. But we are aiming to engage in the shortest possible time, which then it can also happen that there are then delays during the detailed assessment phase, depending on what information is available and so on. So I hope this was clear enough. Marga, if you want to come in on this.
Sure, I can just compliment. So I do want to emphasize that the procedures are very streamlined. So if a city submits an expression of interest, it goes through, there's one gap fund email, and it gets sent to, and both the EIB and World Bank technical secretariats have access to this and regularly check. And so it's reviewed by both secretariats, and the review process is very streamlined. So we, as Giulia mentioned, we meet every 2 weeks to discuss the eligibility of the proposals, and we jointly decide whether the proposal would be followed up by the World Bank or by EIB in partnership with GIZ. And so moving to I think the last question on implementation, the technical assistance, once the proposal or project idea has advanced to the detailed assessment phase, either the World Bank regional team or the EIB and GIZ team works directly with the cities to define the scope, and the resources would be managed by these teams. So as Giulia mentioned in her part of the presentation, the resources don't go directly to the beneficiaries. Rather, it's coursed through the technical expertise that's managed by World Bank and EIB and GIZ. So just to make that clarification, make that point.
Thank you.
Clearly.
Thank you so much, Marga and Giulia. We're at time and we're at 10:30. We've tried to get through in the last hour almost 40 plus questions, but I appreciate that there are some questions that we didn't get to. Please reach out using the Gap Fund website or to me personally for GECoM signatory cities. Before we close, Sanjaya, I just wanted to check with you whether there are any additional questions or if you wanted to close. So over to you, Sanjaya.
Thanks a lot. Just a couple of comments, and maybe if you can react to that. So firstly, of course, just to let all our participants know that the GAP Fund is a member of the MCR 2030, and the cities can have a look at that and have more information from there. But also, I think it would be very useful for cities, because many of the cities are at that stage where they are doing, either they are in the process of doing diagnostics to identify their needs and actions that they need to take, or they have already in possession of well articulated resilience strategies, which can, as you say, the GAP Fund will help to convert the ideas into projects. But there was one very interesting point that you mentioned about the groups of municipalities being in a position to apply. And just to mention that, and you all must be knowing about this, the UCLG, which is a group of 250,000 municipalities around the world, and they work through associations of municipalities, and each association can be anywhere from a few hundred municipalities clubbed together. So I think at least for those, not the entire group, of course, but those which are contiguous, which suffer from transboundary issues, for example, this could be an interesting option. I had two quick questions, if I may. One was because when we look at local governments, we also see the need for them to be well aligned with the national government, and you have talked about the national strategies also. But I was just wondering, would a national government be eligible to apply with a local government, so on behalf of the local government, or perhaps on behalf of a group of local governments which suffer from the same impacts of climate? So that would be something. And the other question was, of course, there is no transfer of funds here. This is simply in the form of technical assistance that you will provide. So I assume that in IPR, the intellectual property rights will be with the city, because they will need to so for example, you help them with the pre-feasibility report, but then they will need to engage probably with the experts and consultants to help them take them to the next stages of procurement and so on. Is it possible for those kind of consultants who are part of the city's system, or the city is going to utilize their services in the next stage of the procurement for the project, to be part of the initial technical assistance work? And lastly, do you have any any cases of groups of cities applying? Because that would be very interesting. And how are you sharing some of these stories, because that would be encouraging to other cities also. Thank you. And I know it's over time, but just quick answers. Thanks.
I can answer a couple of questions, and then and Giulia, I'm sure she's probably better positioned to respond to other questions. I think on your first question regarding whether a national entity or government can apply on behalf of the city, I guess a simple answer would be it depends. The proposal definitely has to demonstrate city level ownership. So a national entity could apply, but we would also need to see to it that there's endorsement from the local governments, that it is part of their city strategy and is part of their it's part of their a specific set of goals that that they want to achieve. And then on the question about whether or not to involve external consultants during the implementation of the technical assistance. So as I mentioned, the grant resources are mobilized by the World Bank and EIB or GIZ teams. And so if there's a specific request to involve that requires a specific level of expertise that has local knowledge, I think that would have to be a discussion between the city and the implementing team, and when they define the scope of work and the resources required for developing the proposal. And then on the question about your last question about stories, yes, we do have a number of, we try to post some news articles and blogs. And recently, I think in April, we announced the first round of grants that were approved that will be supported by the GAP Fund. And we tried to give some examples. We have some examples in Africa, some in South Asia, East Asia, and we try to get that out on a regular basis just to give cities an idea of what's being approved. And then on the question about whether we've received applications from associations or city associations, I think maybe Giulia would be able to speak more about that.
Yes. So first of all, yes, I agree with what Marga said on everything. I just want to mention that on the communication side, of course, as soon as we start actually working with the cities, because we are now at the very initial stage, so the TA has not been deployed yet, but as soon as we have something to share about concrete actions and concrete impacts of the GAP Fund, we will also try to publicize it as stories about the city, not about the GAP Fund, but about what the GAP Fund can help the city achieve. And so this is forthcoming when we will have some more details to share. And then in terms of the associations of municipalities, I think for the time being, we have received only one application, which is still under discussion. So it's not yet something that is happening a lot, but we are constantly replying to cities that like smaller cities. We try to see whether it is possible to increase the scope of smaller projects, and in that case we encourage them to apply potentially in conjunction with other neighboring cities. I just want to mention that it doesn't need to be a formal association of municipalities. We can accept grouped application, provided that we have one entity that is the one counterpart, basically, so we don't have to deal with all of the different municipalities. So there is not too much request from associations of municipalities as of yet. And in terms of the intellectual property rights, this is a very important question. And of course, the studies and the deliverables that will be developed by the consultants will be, the cities would be able to use them and to share them with other entities that can then provide further support. In terms of the involvement of consultants, other consultants that are not recruited by World Bank, EIB, or GIZ, that is complicated in particular. So it is to be discussed on a case-by-case basis. But in general, I would say we have to be aware of potential conflicts of interest and insider information that would prevent these consultants from then applying to other contracts later on in the procurement process. So if they have participated or they were involved and they have privileged information on something that was done before, normally this would prevent them to bid for other contracts later on. So this is something that we need to be aware of, and that's why normally they wouldn't be involved. But it is, of course, to be discussed on a case-by-case basis. I hope this answers the questions.
No, thank you very much. Very clear. And I think we are now ending. So I'll just hand over to Mai for any further announcements and then the closing.
Thank you very much, Sanjaya, Marga, Asma, and also Giulia. This has been very insightful sessions. And I think many of the cities listening now to the session will probably started to get ready to submit the EOI for further consideration. And we really do encourage the cities, particularly those who have the evidence and already the diagnostics about what your city needs are, and already have obtained the city's officials commitment in the process to do apply for this initial support to prepare the project for financing. And there was a question that was asking about how to get the local governments become aware of all of this new initiative or like existing initiative and good resources that would be able to help the cities to progress on the resilience building. I would also encourage like all of you who are here at the webinar now to also get in touch with your cities and make sure that they also are able to join these webinars and join the mailing list of what we are providing through the Making City Resilient 2030. We have a whole bunch of resources and knowledge toolkits that are useful for cities at different stages and that may look for a different type of support and information. And we will continue to do the series of the webinars in the next months towards the year end, and we'll be announcing more of what is coming up through the mailing list that we normally circulate. And we also will be sharing the PowerPoint presentation and also the recording of this session at the webpage that we already have dropped at the URL in the chat box. So please check back for any information that you want to also review and refer to. And with this, I also thank you again, the team from the City Gap Funds, and for all the audience who stay throughout, even though we are going a little bit over time. And we also look forward for your further engagement in the Gap Fund and also in other subsequent Making City Resilience webinars. So have a good day to all of you and see you again in the next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.